On this episode of Strangers and Aliens, pulp science fiction, I'm asking the question, is The Green Hills of Earth the greatest sci-fi short story of all time? And the answer is probably no, but it definitely deserves to be part of the conversation. Hey, I'm Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens, and I am here to talk about this short story, which is in the collection that has the title of the short story as the title of the collection. But the story is Robert A. Heinlein's story, The Green Hills of Earth. And like I said, I don't think it necessarily is the greatest science fiction short story of all time. I wouldn't even know where to start to have that conversation because there's just so many of them and so many great short stories that are just out there in the canon and outside of the canon too. This is definitely one of the stories that I would say is probably in the canon as far as just the influence it had and as far as just the impact it had on the science fiction community at the time, but also on people afterward. And it just, I love it. I'm just going to, spoiler alert, I love this story. Now, if you are listening to this on the audio podcast feed, this is part of my series that I call the Strangers and Aliens OTR. And OTR stands for Old Time Radio. And so as I post this there, this conversation that I'm having here about this story will be posted along with the actual one of the old time radio versions of the story that they did back in the 50s, where they adapted and dramatized this story. And so if you are listening to this on the audio podcast, you will get to actually hear the story, if not the exact same. It's an adaptation, so it's not the exact same thing. If you are watching this on the YouTube feed, you can go over to strangersandaliens.com, where I do have a handful of episodes that are called Strangers and Aliens OTR, and we take a look at an old-time radio episode and then talk about kind of the story itself and talk about the tropes that it gets into and that kind of thing. And there is another Robert Heinlein story that we did for OTR, Universe. And that is based on his Orphans of the Sky. And that is another story that I absolutely adore. Robert A. Heinlein is not one of my favorite writers, but he has written a few of my favorite science fiction stories. And Universe, it's a generation ship story, and I just love that story. The Green Hills of Earth is a much different kind of story, whereas Universe is more of an action-adventure kind of a thing that has this grand conspiracy behind what's this generation ship is doing. So The Green Hills of Earth, though, is a more straightforward story. And before I want to talk about the story, I want to talk a little bit about Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein is one of the big names in science fiction. And he is, like, when you talk about, especially when you're talking about that golden age of science fiction, and you're talking about, like, who are the biggest names in sci-fi, you're talking about Asimov, you're talking about Clarke, and you're talking about Heinlein. And there's other names that can be put into the conversation as well. Bradbury maybe, but these are some of the biggest names, and he was one of the biggest names. Now, one of the reasons he was one of the biggest names in sci-fi because of what this story did in kind of legitimizing science fiction for the general public. But I see in his writing and in his output a lot of different styles. One of the things I would say about him is he definitely knows the tropes, uses the tropes, and he writes to the genre in some ways, especially his juvenile fiction. He writes space opera, and he writes these things that are kind of rote in some ways because they're following what's expected of science fiction, especially of the time. But he's also someone who pushed the boundaries of the genre. And he also became, while he was someone who used the tropes of what had come before, he also started defining new tropes and started defining the genre in some ways to point it to where it was going to go. Even as he was writing and it was changing, he was one of those people who was kind of helping to change it. And he became a boundary pusher. And The Green Hills of Earth was one of those boundary pushing stories, but not in content the way that like Stranger in a Strange Land did, or even Starship Troopers in some ways. And those are two of his big titles. If you've heard of Robert Heinlein, you've heard of those titles probably. Definitely Starship Troopers because of the movie, which is not a great adaptation of the book. But it is an adaptation, and it became its own franchise. Stranger in a Strange Land is one where he really did push a lot of boundaries and kind of just choosing to, take things in directions that they haven't necessarily gone in before or gone in the way that he did it. I'm not saying it's completely 100% original because, there's nothing new under the sun. It's what you do with it. And Robert Heinlein brought himself to what he did with it. And I would say if you are a writer, one of the things as you're looking at Robert Heinlein's stuff, one of the things that can encourage you as you're just looking at his output is he is someone who took the phrase, write what you know, and did that when he wrote science fiction. He wrote what he knew as far as humans and as far as his experience in the military, which is why he was someone who was able to write space opera and military sci-fi in a way that was very realistic feeling, even though it's taking place in outer space in a world that doesn't exist. He wrote what he knew. And even with Green Hills of Earth, he's kind of writing what he knew. He is one of those, like I said, masters. He is one of those, I guess, the grand masters in sci-fi, the big names in sci-fi with a, capital B, capital N, big name. That's what he is. Now, one of the ways he broke boundaries was with this story, with the Green Hills of Earth, because this is a story that was one of the first to break out of the pulps and to break out of the boundaries of, this was for young people, this was for immature people, this was, even though it wasn't necessarily written for that kind of a thing. I mean, science fiction writers weren't necessarily just aiming at the immature reader, but it didn't have a legitimization that it needed in order to catch on with, really to get where it is right now. In some ways, because of what he did with the Green Hills of Earth, Star Wars, Marvel, like all these things that we have now that have just a general pop culture acceptance and a general pop culture impact was because of what he was able to do with the Green Hills of Earth. Now, I'm not saying it all rests on the fulcrum of the Green Hills of Earth, and that I'm not saying that exactly, but I am saying that he broke some boundaries with this because he was able to get this published in a quote-unquote legitimate magazine. This was first published in the Saturday Evening Post, and it opened the way for others to be able to branch out outside of just that sci-fi circle, the pulps. In fact, Isaac Asimov in 1969 said, "I'll never forget the shock that rumbled through the entire world of science fiction fandom when Heinlein broke the slicks barrier by having an undiluted science fiction story of his published in the Saturday Evening Post." Now, the Saturday Evening Post was a weekly publication, and it published all sorts of nonfiction and fiction. And so The Green Hills of Earth was published in 1947. And if you've read the story, or if you're going to read the story, or as we're talking about the story, you'll see it was a sci-fi adventure. And it has a literary bent to it, for sure. But a lot of science fiction did. Even back then, even before 1947, there was a lot of science fiction that had a literary bent and that had legitimate themes to talk about, that had characterization that just felt human and felt real. And so he wasn't the first person to do that, but he was the first person to break through that boundary and break through that barrier. So the title of the story, The Green Hills of Earth, comes from a song within the story called The Green Hills of Earth. And we'll talk about what the song is like and what the song does within the story. But this is something that the song and the songwriter and other song titles of his show up in Heinlein's other stories as part of his the Future History Timeline. Now, I came across the Future History Timeline in a book called The Man Who Sold the Moon, and it was something I bought for 10 cents at a library book sale, and it had a handful of Heinlein's short stories. And one of those short stories, again, like I said, he's not my favorite writer in the world, but he does have a few of my favorite stories. Lifeline was one of those stories, and it really stuck with me when I read it in high school. And I actually reread it for the first time since I read it back in high school. So we're talking 30-some years since I read it. And there were some things that I had forgotten about and some things that I remembered, and it still had a very strong impact on me when I read it, because it's just, Lifeline is quite simply, it's someone who's able to figure out when someone is going to die. He creates a machine that allows him to follow the lifeline of a person to know exactly when they're going to die. And it's 100% accurate. And then it follows this character as he starts making money off of this. But then he starts questioning, how he's using it and questioning if he should use it. And it's a very human story. It's a very funny story as well in some places, and a very tragic story in other places. And so that story, which is not in this collection, but that story was in the Man Who Sold the Moon, and it is part of his future timeline. So what he does in that future timeline, especially when it comes to Reisling, is he's saying that this is someone who created and wrote some of the most memorable and nostalgic and greatest songs in that future age. And in his impact as a songwriter, creating these songs that are just remembered and played and sung, it lasts for decades and decades and decades and decades, and so on. And so that's how that fits into kind of his future timeline. But in that way, it is also something that it's a foundational work for Heinlein himself. And if you haven't read The Green Hills of Earth, and you are a fan of Heinlein, you should. If you haven't read The Green Hills of Earth and you're a fan of science fiction, I would say that this is a story that I would call sci-fi homework, in the sense that it's a great story, first of all. It still holds up, second of all. And it's also something that had a lot of impact on people at the time, and it still lingers today, although it does not necessarily have the name brand impact that it used to have, for sure. So the origin of the story, interestingly enough, is he did not create the phrase, the Green Hills of Earth, and he also did not create the idea that it was a song. And so he actually has an acknowledgement in the book where he says, the phrase, the Green Hills of Earth, derives from a story by C.L. Moore, Mrs. Henry Kuttner, and is used here by her gracious permission. The story he's talking about is called Shambolo, and it's a story about Northwest Smith and another character of hers. And it's about this man who, he's alone, he's lonely, and he is nostalgic for home, and he starts singing a song called The Green Hills of Earth. And he does not use the lyrics from that song. He just uses the title of the song. And it's interesting because he did not realize he had done so. At least that's the official story. The official story is that he wrote the story, Green Hills of Earth. He got it published in the Saturday Evening Post. And then one day, his wife was feeling ill. And he dug up some of his old magazines. I think it was Weird Tales, if I remember correctly. But he dug up some of his old magazines, and he brings them to her. And she's reading these old Northwest Smith stories by C.L. Moore. And at some point, she comes along to Shambolo, and she sits up straight out of bed and calls him in and says, look what happened. Look what you've done. And he then contacts C.L. Moore and her co-writer. He apologizes to them and asks for permission to use the title, which is why you have the acknowledgement here. They were delighted to give him the permission, though. So that is the story behind one of the origin points for this story. So why would I say that this is one of the best, if not the best, short stories? Maybe it's one of the best short stories that I've read. I mean, I probably have read better written stories, and I might have read stories that I engaged with more and enjoyed more. But I still feel like this is one of the best sci-fi stories that I've ever read. And why is that? Well, I think a big part of it is there is a dichotomy of the humanity and the technology that is one of the things that science fiction does so well. It is all about space travel. It is all about a man who, he is an engineer. And so he works the engine rooms of these interplanetary vessels that are going from place to place. And it's long term. And they've just started using some nuclear technology. And they are, as they're making these interstellar travels or interplanetary travels, he is very good at what he does. But he's also a songwriter. And he's also a musician. And so he sings, and he is popular among his friends, and he actually makes money by being a traveling bard in some ways, because he's in an accident that blinds him. And there's this really poignant line in the story where it says something about the last thing he ever saw was the bright light of the explosion or whatever. It's much more poignant when he writes it than when I paraphrase it. But anyway, he's going out and he's traveling from place to place as this blind troubadour. And he is writing songs that are catching on, and people are carrying them. And he's doing some recordings here and there. And he's kind of this traveling troubadour, like you would see back in the 20s and the 30s, where you'd have people just going from town to town, and one step up from a hobo and a beggar, basically. And so blindness changes him, though. Blindness changes his songs. It changes the way he sees the world, because there's this other kind of poignant thing about how every woman that he met was beautiful. And blindness also changes the way he sees the places he goes, because he's seeing them through what he saw before. And so when he goes to a city, he remembers what it was before. When he goes to a planet, he remembers what it was in the early days, maybe, of colonization. And he remembers Earth. And that is where we get the title from. The Green Hills of Earth is this song that he kind of was developing over time as he was making his travels from here to there, but never going back to Earth. And the story itself then kind of really picks up as a narrative with him wanting to go back to Earth. Now, what I started to say was one of the reasons why the Saturday Evening Post might have been so willing to publish this story is because it was written as a kind of profile of this historical figure of noisy Heinlein. And he then it's written in such a way that it's like, here's the background for this man, and here's the way that he kind of started to do this, and here's these events that happened to him along the way, and then here are the events that are kind of the last days of his life. And so it is written as something that would fit into a Saturday Evening Post style magazine of the future. In fact, there's one point at the very beginning of the story where he says something about you wouldn't want to have him come to your house. He's a coarse man. He's an uncouth man. And some of the titles of some of his songs can't be printed in a family magazine. And so he's kind of acknowledging in some ways, I don't know which came first, if he wrote that line before the Saturday Evening Post accepted it, or if the Saturday Evening Post accepted it and that was something that as he was developing the story after being accepted, he added that in because he knew it was going to be in a family magazine. But it's little details like that that kind of pepper through this story that make it more relatable. And it's definitely doesn't take on then a typical narrative where this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's more, like I said, a profile of the man's life. It's a biography, a fictional biography of this man. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there are moments of events that have real poignancy, and it works. It works really well. Now, Heinlein himself is based on someone that Heinlein said he actually knew, and someone who worked in the engine room of a ship and who was blind, but just knew what he was doing and knew it well and knew where everything was and knew what everything did, and who could tell who was approaching by the sound of their footsteps. And that's another thing, like I said, where this is him kind of taking what he knows and extrapolating it into science fiction. And then there's also the nostalgia portion. This is a story that has a deep, deep nostalgia on his last leg of his journey. He's getting old and he wants to go home. And so he tricks his way onto a ship to be able to go home. And then things happen. And in the course of things happen, I want to be careful how much to spoil, although this is one of those stories where I think if it was spoiled for you, it wouldn't matter too much, because it's how it's presented. This is definitely a story that's more about how it's presented and what is presented, and less about what happens and spoiling like the plot details and plot development. But I don't want to give away too much. I will just say this: the story is all about the life of this man and coming to the end of his life, and he wants to return back home to the Green Hills of Earth. And as he's returning home, some things happen, and there's some tragic stuff that goes on, and he's able to complete this greatest song that he ever wrote, The Green Hills of Earth. It's the best of sci-fi, like I said. There is a real deep humanity in the midst of this awesome advances in travel and this awe of wonder as space has opened up. But also, even in the midst of the awe and wonder, there's a mundanity of just, this is life. These are men who are out there on these ships, and they're rough and they're tumble and they're greasy because they're getting into the engine room where there's gears and there's pistons and there's grease and there's atomic power. And so even in the midst of this wonder of discovery, it's just making your way through the world. And as Heinlein is making his way through the world, he's writing this song. So as much as I would love to talk about the end of the story, I'm not going to do that right now, because I don't want to spoil this too much, because I want you to see like what he's doing in the midst of writing this song. And I'll just say, I love this story. I love the feelings it evokes in me, even as I've read it and heard it multiple times. When I say heard it, there's been a couple different versions that were done for like X-1, and I think CBS Radio Theater, and Leonard Nimoy does a reading of this, which is on Spotify, which if you would like to hear it, but I think it's also, there's some YouTube videos where they just take their audio recording and put the picture of the album cover on there. And then of course, I've read the story a few times as well. And it evokes this sense of nostalgia. It evokes the sense of longing for home. It evokes the sense of idealized feelings and nostalgia for home, not just longing for the concrete reality of home, but longing for the nostalgic reality of home. And so for me, one of the things, or a couple of the things that really resound with me are the character of Heinlein, who is a writer, and I'm a writer. By my book, Ghosts of the Future, or Time for Everything, anthology, inspired by Ecclesiastes 3. I got to throw that in somewhere, I guess. But it also definitely gets into that nostalgic feeling and that evocation of just that longing for home as you're out and as you are getting older and as you are doing the things that you're doing, and you've moved away from home and you've moved away from the things of the past. Not even just a physical removal of you from home, but a chronological removal of you from home. But for me as a Christian, it also brings to mind that kind of future nostalgia that we have, that future longing that we have as we are looking forward to just what happens after death with heaven and what happens in beyond this life, and that kind of longing that we have for that reunification with God. And so in some ways, maybe we're not just thinking about a future nostalgia, but a past nostalgia for the relationship that we used to have with God when things were perfect and when things, sin hadn't entered the world. And so it makes me think of that, the kind of things, kind of through, like C.S. Lewis's writings, where he has this kind of this longing for Narnia that you feel, and he writes about this kind of longing and nostalgia for things we have not experienced when he's talking about, I think it's in The Weight of Glory. And it makes me think of Ecclesiastes 3:11, which says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end." And John 14:2-3, which is Jesus describing heaven. And he's not just describing heaven as something in the future, but he's also describing heaven as home. "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you also may be where I am in." And so that's one of the things that, just as as a believer, that as I'm thinking about the nostalgia that this story makes me think about. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this story. This is one of the reasons why I think it's one of my favorite stories, is because of just how much thought time, how much headspace this has occupied for me as I'm thinking about this story, and just how it makes me feel and what I think about it. The story also, there's definitely ideas of sacrifice and heroism and things like that. And it's not the space opera kind of action adventure, but there is that heroic element as well. So the story made a huge impression, not just on me, but it also made an impression on the people of the world. I already talked about Isaac Asimov. There's an award for science fiction poetry called the Heinlein Award. And then Apollo 15, when it went to the moon, they were going to go to a crater that's named Heinlein, that they named Heinlein. And they were going to go there, and they were going to quotes from the Green Hills of Earth. There was also, I think, a crater called Dune, and there was a crater that was named after something from Arthur C. Clarke, but I can't remember what it is. But as they were doing this, they realized they didn't have time to go to the crater and do this kind of ceremony. So before they left, this is a conversation between Mission Control and the people on the mission. And so for Mission Control, he says, "As the space poet Heinlein would say, we're ready for you to come back again to the homes of men on the cool green hills of Earth." And then one of the astronauts says, "That's from the Green Hills of Earth. That's the one we talked about before the flight. Have you read that one?" And then another one says, "Oh yeah, that was a favorite for me when I was a kid. Have you read it?" And then the first one says, "Sure. We pray for one last landing on the globe that gave us birth, to rest our eyes on fleecy skies and the cool green hills of Earth." And thinking about perception kind of stuff, if you think about where we are, the thing that's really different about the Earth is cool green hills with the fleecy skies and blue skies. So Heinlein's perception of a meaningful thing for the blind poet of the spaceways is pretty good. that he could transport himself out. And here we have black skies and a gray surface. Dramatic difference. I always think it's amazing. Some of those science fiction guys can really project themselves out there that way. And so that actually was from the lunar surface, where they quoted from the green hills of Earth. And I want to just leave this off with reading some of the verses from this. And one of the things I like about just the rhythm of this is the way that, especially with that last one that we read there, it has that kind of rhythm, whereas C.L. Moore's rhythm was kind of I think it was an A-B couplet. This one has a little bit of extra. We've tried each spinning space mote and reckoned its true worth. Take us back again to the homes of men on the cool green hills of Earth. The arching sky is calling, spacemen back to their trade. All hands stand by, free falling, and the lights below us fade. Out rides the sons of Terra, far drives the thundering jet. Up leaps the race of Earthmen, out far and onward yet. We pray for one last landing on the globe that gave us birth. Let us rest our eyes on the fleecy skies and the cool green hills of Earth. And there have been a number of people who put it to music, and the best is actually from the old time radio. I've listened to some of the science fiction filkers, I guess, I don't know what you call them, because I wasn't a part of convention communities in the time when filking was really a big thing, and that was where they would write songs and stuff. But people put this to music, and the recordings I've listened to haven't been the greatest. Now, I haven't listened to all of them by far, I haven't even come close, but yeah. Anyway, that is The Green Hills of Earth. If you have not read it, I highly, highly recommend it. If you are listening to this on the audio podcast, I'm about to hit play on the actual old time radio episode. But for those of you who are watching right now, I want to say thank you so much for spending time with me here on YouTube. Go to strangersandaliens.com or look up our podcast anywhere you can catch an audio podcast. And just look up Strangers and Aliens. It should bring us up, and you'll be able to, fast forward ahead to the second half of this episode, and you'll be able to listen to that old time radio recording that they did. But until next time, for you who are watching on YouTube, thank you so much for spending time with me. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, please check out my book, The Ghosts of the Future. Ghosts of the Future is a science fiction book that, I'm no Heinlein, but that's because I'm Avery. So we all bring to things what is us, what makes us us. And there's nothing new under the sun except for what you bring to it. And Heinlein proved that. He took C.L. Moore's thing accidentally, brought himself to it, and created this amazing work of literature. So until next time, as you're traveling the spaceways, as you're making your way through life, and as you're feeling a deep nostalgia for the past or for the future, I want to wish you Godspeed.